everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome. Obviously, our guest today is Ciara Meehan, who did a PhD at UCD and is now a reader at the University of Hertfordshire. Her kind of big book, I suppose, a few years ago was A History of the Cosgrave Party, which was a history of Fine Gael from 1925 to 33, which she's followed up this year with, I think I'm right in saying, Ciara, it's becoming a Christmas bestseller, isn't it? It's edging up the list.
Yeah, it's edging up the list. The sales are steady on us, so I'll take that.
You're not retiring anytime soon. Anyway, so
No,
yes, with Stephen Collins, she's produced Saving the State, A History of Fine Gael from Collins to Varadka. And then Ciara, and we'll get to this later on in the conversation, also has a great interest in the gendered experience of everyday life. So really, to begin, Ciara, just before we get to the book proper, obviously, the PhD was on Fine Gael. Why, of all the things you could do when you're sitting there starting a PhD, is the history of a party that's kind of been ignored to a degree, and the very much the kind of political workings of that party? Why was that something you thought, yes, this is what I need to spend 3 years of my life doing?
In a way, you've sort of answered your own question there by saying that it was a party that had been pretty much ignored. And as you know, one of the criteria for a PhD is originality. So there was an obvious gap to be filled in the literature by doing the Fine Gael party. But also, I had always been really interested in the Irish Revolution, as so many young academics are at that time period. But I was particularly intrigued with what happened afterwards, after these centuries of campaigning for Irish independence, what actually happened once that independence was achieved, how the state went about building itself, how democracy functioned or didn't function, perhaps. And given that there was so much written about the new states that emerged in Central and Eastern Europe as well at that time, after the collapse of empire at the end of the First World War, I just thought it would be really interesting to think about the Irish experience. And that's what led me to doing the thesis I did. I would also say as well, I was slightly influenced by the fact that at UCD you have, of course, the political papers of the party too. So it was really a case of going down 3 flights of stairs and I was there in my archive. So location was also a factor, I suppose.
Do you think, in a way, I mean, given all the centenary noise at the minute, where we're kind of working through the War of Independence, and then we're going to start with the Civil War. I know in the work we do around Century Island, there's also the sense that suddenly you're going to get to 1923, 2023, and everybody's going to say, that's it, pack up the tent, the decade's over.
Sure.
In a way, is that the kind of gap that Fine Gael fell into historiographically, that it wasn't a revolution? State building is kind of boring, it has to be done, but it's boring. And all the interesting stuff started when Dev got on board. Is that what's...
Yeah, I think that's a really fair assessment. Fine Gael is not the most exciting party to write about, or state building is not sexy history in comparison to the revolution. It's essential everyday necessities for building a state, but there's nothing particularly exciting about it. And somebody like W.T. Cosgrave, though an important figure in terms of building the state, he's not a charismatic character. It doesn't divide loyalties in the same way that De Valera did, perhaps. And I think, there's an element as a result that the Fine Gael, the 20s in general, have been or had been overlooked. I mean, that's changing now, obviously. But there is also, I suppose, that tendency when you get to the birth of the state to then perhaps skip forward and think about the creation of the Republic in 1948 as well, which of course then means that the Fine Gael era gets missed out, or even maybe to go to the 1937 Constitution. But there's, in terms of kind of the landmark moments, although the 20s are really important, there is nothing that's seen as quite a signature moment in the history of the state as there is in 22 or 37 or 48.
And just, I mean, obviously you think about Ferreter's book on Dev that was kind of, famously Mary Hannafin demanded that every school get a copy. And you had that Fianna Fáil kind of building of its own history of Dev as being central at it. Is the problem in a way with Cosgrave is not simply that the work that had to be done wasn't dramatic and romantic. It wasn't shooting at soldiers and fighting civil wars. It was building the state. It was civil service heavy. I mean, does he pale into insignificance and Cumann Gael disappear in a way because Cosgrave does come across as very dry, he does come across as very boring, and once they lose that election in 1932, he's kind of done. That he just doesn't have that, although a seminally important political figure that you could think about, as you say, nation state builders in the 20s who have huge kind of mausoleums built in their memory. Cosgrave just gone.
Yeah, I think that's quite fair. It's one of the reasons why when Fine Gael is being created that the party is so willing to embrace Eoin O'Duffy as well, because he's seen as having the promise of being another Collins figure. I mean, it doesn't pan out that way, but he seems to have all that promise of charisma. And actually, once O'Duffy is stage managed out of the party and Cosgrave returns to the helm, there's all these really interesting correspondence between members of the party, quite high profile people, lamenting Cosgrave's return to the leadership, saying things like, you know, any chance we have of beating Fianna Fáil is gone now. So Cosgrave, yeah, he once the 32 election is over and Cumann Gael have gone to the opposition benches, he's sort of a spent force by that stage. I mean, there's still people who have loyalty to him, but in terms of seeing him as the future leader or further leader of the party who can offset the advances of Fianna Fáil, he's not seen as someone who has that ability.
And what, obviously, once you've done the Cosgrave book, obviously this year is the big book on Fine Gael, which for a historian does that kind of quite unusual thing that goes up to almost yesterday, that you take in the 21st century, you take in the Varadka into the title. What was the motivation for doing that? Was it just simply continuing the story? But in a way, why pitch the story so far to now?
Yeah. I've always wanted to write a history of Fine Gael ever since the PhD was finished. This was something that I had wanted to do. I don't have the time to do it on my own. So that was part of the reason why Stephen Collins became involved with it as my co-author. And of course, with Stephen being a journalist, he comes from a different place than me. And so it seemed appropriate with him on board that we do take it up to the present day. But also, I think one of the reasons why we did was once Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael entered coalition, or at least even before that officially happened and the rumours were happening, there were so many people taking this kind of long look back at both parties' history and the evolution of the political system and trying to make sense of how both parties had arrived at where they were and had reached a point where they could seemingly bury their old animosity and join together in a coalition. And I suppose that was one of the motivations for going right up to the Varadka era, to think about how the party had come so far from, you know, being one of the political children of the Civil War to now being in government with the other political child of the Civil War, effectively. So, yeah, it was about taking that really long view and thinking about how the party has got to where it is today, what the lines of continuity are, but also how it's changed over time as well.
But as a historian, the terrifying thing must be when somebody says to you, somewhere around the late 1980s, there's no more archives.
Yeah,
you're on your own. That you are kind of mixing that kind of strange sense of this, like the Cosgrave book, this really deep archival project, with then the end of it, which is it's material, but it doesn't have that same stamp. I mean, did you find that difficult, or was, I mean, I got no sense reading it. I can figure out loosely which bits you did, but I mean, it's seamlessly written. Is there a point in the production of the book where you just kind of said, Stephen, that's yours, that's the modern stuff, that's the journalist stuff?
You know, it's funny, everybody assumes that I wrote the first half and Stephen wrote the second half. We co-wrote nearly all of the chapters together. And in some cases, some paragraphs even are co-written. You know, that was the extent to which we worked together on it. I did struggle with the later stuff, I will be honest, because, as you say, it's not in my, you know, in my comfort zone to work without archives and so on. But I suppose we benefited from having access to some people's privately held papers. And we also made a lot of use of oral history as well, or interviews, I suppose, as the journalists call them instead. So there were elements, I suppose, of what historians would work with, but just taken much, you know, up to the contemporary. It was a challenge, though, writing it at times, and writing with a journalist as well. My very first draft that I sent Stephen, he rang me then and we had this conversation where he said to me, I think you need to reconsider, you know, your tone a little bit in it, because I had all the usual academic trappings of this chapter will make this argument and it will draw on and so on and so on. And because the book is obviously written for more of a general audience as opposed to, you know, it's specifically academic one, that wasn't going to make it particularly readable for the wider audience. So yeah, both the absence of archives from the 80s onwards and changing my style, I think, they were both things that I struggled with at certain points during the process.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but just to remind everybody, if you have got questions for Ciara as we go along, type them in, and then Joel keep an eye on that, and we'll come back to those later. So just that experience, Ciara, as you say, I mean, all the training we all have is to do very kind of turgid academic things with all that lovely framework that keeps us safe of footnotes and qualifications and sophistications. To have somebody who then is driven by a completely different way of writing, probably by a publisher as well who's expecting a completely different kind of book. Was that the stuff of nightmares? Was it a blossoming that will allow you to see your life different in the future? I mean, how traumatic was it?
Do you know, it wasn't that traumatic at all, actually. Initially, when Stephen and I talked about doing this, I was active on Twitter at the time, and I had tweeted asking for people for their advice about co-writing. And I would say 99.9% of people who responded came back with, don't do it. And I think even within academic, you know, communities, co-writing can often be a fairly traumatic experience. Once we got past the initial me writing like an academic and Stephen writing like a journalist, we sort of met almost in the middle, and we both edited each other's work as well to try and get it, you know, our voices into each other's work. It made the process much smoother, and after that initial kind of teething stage, I can honestly say it went quite smoothly then with us. There were times where I would suggest to Stephen that, you know, because of my awareness of the archives, that there were certain things that he might want to draw in, and then again, because he's, you know, such a veteran political commentator, there are events that he remembers covering and was able to give other angles to me because of that. So rather than our different disciplines being a drawback, I actually think they were quite useful in terms of us both rethinking, I suppose, certain things. I'd also say that I feel like my writing style has evolved a lot as a result of this book. And obviously with academic writings, there are certain what's the word I'm looking for, certain forms that, you know, need to be followed, that this article will, you know, and so on. But at times, I don't know, in the past I've maybe got a bit bogged down in dense writing, if that makes sense. And I think writing this book has perhaps challenged me to be a little more accessible, perhaps in how I articulate my thoughts.
So would you do it all again? Are you and Stephen going to write another book, or?
I'm currently lined up for another project, so it'd be a long one, you know, be down the road. But I would very happily work with Stephen again. Yeah.
And can you say what the new project is?
Completely different. It's going to be a history of widows in the 20th century in Ireland. I'm part of a new network that's just been funded to look at the position of the family in Ireland, and different definitions of it. And so my work will look at how widows reconstitute family after bereavement.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that, but it kind of preempts my next question, which was a question from Oliver Rafferty, which in a way kind of works to the layout of the book. For those of you in America, I wouldn't call it a Twitter storm, but some questions that appeared, Ciara, about the cover. The first president leader of Fine Gael was not on the cover. He was tucked away on the spine. So Oliver's question is, why do you think Fine Gael as a party seemed to deny its blue shirt antecedents, or at least not to accept them?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would correct you there, Mike, because I know he's on the spine, but I wouldn't say he's tucked away on it.
Okay, fair enough. Depends how you arrange your books.
Well, that's the thing. So
he's part of the most visible.
It is. He is the most visible, because that's how most people will see it on the bookshelves. But I take the point, though. I mean, no matter where we placed O'Duffy, I think, it was going to raise certain issues. But to go back to the question about why do Fine Gael kind of deny that element of their history, O'Duffy is such a controversial character. And Mike, you will know this even better than I do because of your work, his relationship with the blue shirts, and his own expression of fascist thought at times, a lot of the time, doesn't sit comfortably with a party that, as their title hints at, because, well, not hints at, is quite clear about, and it comes from the party's own self-labelling. It's a party that is about building the state, about defending the state, and about defending democracy. And O'Duffy's perceived threat through fascism to those claims, doesn't sit comfortably with the party. And if we think of today how the slur of blue shirt rather is still used to criticize members and to basically slag off people who support the party or politicians within it, you can see how they are so quick to dismiss or just not talk about O'Duffy at all. And what I find really interesting is they don't even go back to W.T. Cosgrave, they go back to Michael Collins instead, which again is why we framed the book Collins to Varadka, even though Collins, of course, was dead before Fine Gael was ever founded.
I was going to ask you, because that was the other great sort of thing I saw constantly on Twitter, and is mentioned in some of the reviews, that you went back in the title of the book, from Collins to Varadka, you went back to a man who, for all his prominence in Irish history, was never a member of the party because the party didn't exist before he was killed. So, I mean, I've read the book, but I mean, just to kind of illustrate to people who are listening, why did you make that decision?
Yeah,
I appreciate it's probably good marketing to have his name there, but I know in the book there's a kind of intellectual reason.
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, you are right. There is a marketing reason behind that, but also from the intellectual perspective, we wouldn't have put Collins on the cover were there not, we thought, at least a justification for it, and that is that Fine Gael sees him as a father figure for the party. He occupies a very special position in the party's pantheon of heroes. And as Anne Dolan, has written, from the party's perspective, he died before he did enough to damn himself. And so he doesn't have the same kind of controversy that surrounds W.T. Cosgrave in terms of, the challenges he faced in building the state. And he definitely doesn't have the tarnish of Eoin O'Duffy and the blue shirts and the fascist movement. So for Fine Gael, it suits them to go back to this romantic revolutionary figure. And our book is as much about looking at the party's own self-perceptions and their own interpretation of their history as it is looking at its actual factual history. And at various points, there isn't a chapter about Collins in the book, but he does appear at various points. And that's when people like Enda Kenny, for example, during the whole financial crisis, positioned himself in the context of Michael Collins. And, you know, he talked about having to save the state again in the way that Collins had saved Ireland, you know, and brought about independence. And I think it's really fascinating the way that the party have used him. Even when Michael Noonan conceded after the 2002 election and he was being interviewed on RTE News, right behind his shoulder was this bust of Michael Collins. You know, he is an ever-present figure in the party, despite, as you say, being dead long before Fine Gael was ever created. So yeah, we don't make any claims that he was a member of the party or indeed a leader. But that's something that the party themselves, I suppose, have tried to present, perhaps.
I think to be honest, I think you're spot on, because I mean, I think that watching 2016, when Enda and co were still in government, and overseeing that commemoration, in a way, the kind of the reaching they had to do, because the people who signed the proclamation weren't there, as it were, natural people. Their natural people come to the fore post 18. So Colin does sit there. Anyway, Joe wants to ask some questions, so he's going to take the driving seat. And people, please send in your questions.
Thanks very much, actually. And, you know, I want to move just up a little bit forward to talk about Gareth Fitzgerald and that era. And this perhaps actually straddles two areas in which you're expert. There's the history of Commonwealth and Gael, but also there's the question of gender and family and constructions of womanhood, but constructions of manhood too. And I'm just wondering about that competition between Gareth and Charlie at the time, as models perhaps of Irish masculinity, if we can dare say that. I think it's said of Gareth, could this possibly be true, that he carried an umbrella, that men in Ireland didn't carry umbrellas? They certainly didn't push prams.
Sure.
But they were two different. Anything that you can say about that to help us?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the 1980s Irish politics is very much characterised by the clash of these two big personalities representing two political traditions, and Gareth Fitzgerald being positioned as Gareth the Good by supporters, which of course casts all sorts of aspersions then on Haughey as a result. From the perspective of women's history, Gareth is often seen in a very positive light. You know, he does a lot, in fairness to him, in that time period to try and bring women more fully into Fine Gael. Equally, though, you could say that he's responding to a changing environment, because you have the Women's Political Association and so on being formed, and even going back to the 70s, you had the, you know, why not a woman slogan for elections. So Gareth is, I think, picking up on this idea that women are trying to advance themselves within politics, and he is responding to that. And someone like Gemma Hussey would speak very highly of Fitzgerald's efforts. Within his constitutional crusade, you know, people will point to it and say that this is further example of his endorsement of women and their position in society. But again, I think it needs to be read very carefully. So something like the divorce referendum, which of course didn't pass at that time, he was, you know, in some circles, it's seen as a progressive step forward to offer people the opportunity to exit marriages that haven't worked. And, you know, the argument made at the time that marital breakdown happens regardless of whether divorce is available or not. But the way Fitzgerald approached it was still couched, I think, in quite conservative terms, because his argument was that divorce would allow couples to then remarry their new partners, as opposed to, I suppose, living in sin. And for him, divorce was about protecting the institution of marriage rather than breaking it down. So it is progressive in the respect of bringing Ireland in line with what's happening in other European countries and giving women opportunities. But I think you need to be careful not to overstate how progressive Fitzgerald was in the same respect.
Indeed. Thanks very much. And continuing just with that coalition government at the time, are actually going back a little bit to the Liam Cosgrave government at the time. And I'm just thinking about the role of media, sorry, to move away a little bit from where we were. The Irish media, who tend to be somewhat deferential, at least not as scandalous or not as partisan, perhaps, as their American counterparts, indeed. But it said that there was one single television program, a comedy actually, called Paul's Pictorial Weekly, that supposedly was instrumental in bringing about the defeat of that government. Is that conceivable? Is that possible? Is that the way that Irish media and politicians interact? Could that be true?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I actually interviewed Frank Kelly, who was one of the actors in Hall's Pictorial Weekly, and I asked him that question, you know, to what extent did he feel that he and his colleagues contributed to the fall of the government? Because in certain circles, the defeat of the Fine Gael Labour National Coalition in '77 is attributed to the influence of Hall's Pictorial Weekly, and he sort of laughed off that they would have that amount of power. But he did point out, nonetheless, that what Halls did, and one of the reasons why it was so popular at the time, was there were characters within both Fine Gael and Labour that made it easy to satirise them, and that in a way that they were identifiable. You know, he pointed out that once Fianna Fáil came into power, Hall sort of lost its sheen a little bit because there weren't as many quirky characters, and it wasn't as easy to identify who was being portrayed. But you know, the depiction of Richie Ryan as Richie Roon, the Minister for Hardship, and so on, it certainly helped foster this feeling of a very tough government that were taking, you know, not necessarily difficult measures, but we're being tough in the way that they dealt with decisions as well. So it didn't help by any means the way that people viewed the government at the time. But you know, Frank Kelly also talks about how he would have politicians coming up to him sort of suggesting that they would like to be included in the programme, in the sense that you were nobody, sort of, if you weren't satirized by them too. So I think, you know, it's a bit of both. It was difficult for the government to be portrayed in that way, but also it didn't hurt as well to have yourself acknowledged, because at least if you were on the programme, it suggested you were a key player.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And there is a question here actually from Deirdre Foley, and I think it follows on from something that you were saying earlier, and it's about Fine Gael and its appeal to the women's vote at the time. And Deirdre says, hi Ciara, hello Deirdre. Great, she says, to hear you discussing the wide range of your research, of course. And she often gets the sense these days that Fine Gael enjoys styling itself as the party that legalised same-sex marriage and repealed the Eighth Amendment, eliding, she says, the role of activist groups, and wonders, how does your book assess the party's role in these referenda?
Yeah. Hi, Deirdre, first of all. Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Deirdre. I think there has been, and not just Fine Gael, but I suppose because they were in government at the time, they are naturally claiming it as their initiative. But I think in a lot of political circles, there is a tendency to claim responsibility for positive change that happens because they are the party that oversee what happens. But really, with the same-sex marriage referendum and the Repeal the Eighth campaign, the momentum for change there came from civil society, from grassroots campaigns. And what Fine Gael did was to respond to a changing demand and a growing demand in Irish society. And that's one of the points that we try to make in the book. And I think if you look back through kind of Fine Gael's longer history as well, even back to the failed attempt to legalise contraception in the 1970s, when of course William Cosgrave voted against his own government, we need to remember as well that that wasn't Fine Gael and Labour being progressive at the time by trying to introduce this legislation. It's a result of the finding in the Mary McGee case as well. So often when we see this sort of legislation being enacted, it's a result of lobbying from outside groups, of decisions by the court system, or even Europe acting as an agent for change as well. Very often the political establishment, whether it is Fine Gael or any of the other parties, are responding to those demands rather than initiating it themselves.
And just, I mean, building on that, there's another question from Alison Martin, which she sort of said, even if not particularly charismatic, was W.T. Cosgrave a good leader in your opinion? Was he disadvantaged by the many challenges he faced, state building, etc.? And it almost speaks to that 21st century way of Fine Gael in rule, is that, you know, you look at the history of the state, they've been in office for a remarkably short period of time.
Yeah.
As when you look at the whole, and yet they spin this narrative, perhaps, as you say, going back to the Collins metaphor of kind of saving the state, this idea that they then built the state, they've come in the 21st century and saved it from bankruptcy, they've liberalized it, legalized everything. Going back to Cosgrave and onwards, I mean, is that part of their kind of trick in the way they spin their own history, that, you know, even if Ireland seems to be facing into horrific problems, that's when they come good?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of a modern take on the party. So when Cosgrave lost power in 1932, both he and his colleagues were absolutely convinced that Fianna Fáil, as this untested political party, would come in, make a hames of it, and then Fine Gael would come back and show the people that these were that they were the only people to run the state. And obviously it didn't work out that way. And I think the sense of disillusion in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, I mean, you can keep going, meant that they really weren't that preoccupied with spinning their history, so to speak. And when they did get into power, it was often on the back of economic difficulties, where voters got kind of fed up with Fianna Fáil, or, you know, the impact on their pocket perhaps, and voted for a change. Fine Gael, usually, obviously in coalition, then come in and have to deal with the aftermath of it, and then very quickly exit out of power again. But after Garrett, once his leadership is over, the party is sort of flailing around then. They've lost their next charismatic leader. They're having an identity crisis. And I think it's really at that point that's where they start then talking about this longer term reputation. I mean, obviously it was there with William Cosgrave. You know, it's been said that whenever he had to make a decision, he would look to himself and think, what would WT have done? But in terms of the media spin, the propaganda that the party put out, I think it's the more modern version of the party, only because the earlier version of the party is too disillusioned to really even act on that element of it.
Or too blue shirt.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, should we move away from politics? And Joe, do you want to guide us away from the history of the party?
Yeah, please, because I'm yes, I'm really excited here about the work that. Yes, go on. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, before we move away, can I just make one point? And I'm shamelessly doing this, and it's not an attempt to deflect away from the cover of the book, as controversial as it has been. But one of the things that really interests me about people's criticisms of the cover, and there it is, this is my party piece where I hold it all up, is about positioning of where it is. For me, the most depressing thing about this book is the lineup of men on it. And I'm really fascinated that some women have said it to me, but generally speaking, you know, the critics of the cover haven't at any point said, where are the women? And of course, they're not on the cover of the book because it is a history of the party through the lens of their leaders. But it really does speak to the gender imbalance that exists, not just in Fine Gael, but in the Irish political system as well. And yeah, I mean, that actually, Mike, to go back to your question about how painful was the book to write, that more than anything, being a woman myself, obviously, is what really got me about the book. But I will stop ranting about that now. And sorry, Joseph.
No,
come back in with your question.
That's entirely relevant to the kind of question that I want to ask. Thanks very, very much, actually, because I'm interested in the construction of the Irish family and the gendering of the Irish family space. And one question might be just about the rise of feminism. And I remember as a child seeing the copies of Women's Realm and Women's Own and these various women's magazines. They all seemed identical. And to my mind, they were full of knitting patterns and recipes and that kind of stuff. But some people have claimed that these were precursors in some way of feminism. And can that be true?
Yeah, absolutely. I would be one of those people who would make that claim. And funny enough, I was actually working on this earlier today. So this is not a pre-prepared prop. It just happens to be a coincidence. But this is a copy of Woman's Way from 1967. And if you look at the cover of it, it is exactly what you've described. I don't know if you can see that, but it has, you know, cookery queries. It's the fashion issue. You know, it's the very typical cover on it. And you look at that and you think, okay, well, these are women's magazines, as Betty Friedan argued in America, that consigned women to the home and very much really reiterated the domestic ideology. But actually, what's really interesting about Women's Way and Woman's Choice and Young Woman that were all publishing in the 1960s, sorry, I'm just flicking through because I'm trying to find the page here, is that they started to complicate the idea of the domestic. And so they dealt with issues that would later become the hallmarks of the second wave or the women's liberation movement in Ireland, introducing issues around contraception, divorce, even abortion, which didn't come onto the political agenda until the 1980s. And at a very low level, because they're not in-your-face feminists by any means, but they're talking about the position of women in society. They're pushing an equality agenda effectively. And one of the kind of most vocal voices for doing that was Monica McEnroy. And one of her pieces that she has in here is about the so-called illegitimate child, as the term was at the time, which, you know, obviously is no longer in usage. But she talks about, you know, people's perceptions and how illegitimate children and unmarried mothers are cast out and marginalized in society. And her two-page spread, you know, it's very much a plea for society to be more fair and just in how it treats the women of that nature. And so it really contrasts with, you know, the advertisements for Sunbeam and things like that you see in it. And, you know, I think because of Betty Friedan and that backlash of women's magazines that the feminine mystique prompted, it's taken a long time for people to consider women's magazines as a source for thinking about feminist issues. And of course, it's not like Spare Rib or Ms., you know, in America, but definitely peppered within all of the traditional themes are these other articles that are prompting readers to think more broadly about the world that they inhabit and encouraging them as well to push their own boundaries in a form of like popular feminism.
I find that really fascinating, Ciara, and perhaps they were even saying that this was a space, a printed space in which it was permitted, where it was possible for women to say this, whereas of course within the newspapers, which were controlled by men and read by men, perhaps they weren't able or allowed to say these things.
Yeah, I mean, Woman's Way, when it's launched in 1963, is under the editorship of Sean O'Sullivan, but shortly afterwards passes to Caroline Mitchell, and the other magazines are edited by women as well. There are some male contributors, but generally speaking, they're women staff based. And they obviously had to be careful with the censor's office in terms of what they did and didn't incorporate into it. But through the letters pages, for example, and I know there's all sorts of debates about the authenticity of those, but they did create discursive spaces where women, often under the protection of anonymity, could articulate things that weren't comfortable to talk about in society. And it's really interesting to see how the letters pages change over time as well. And I'm not just talking about the Agni Aunt letters, but those that are written to the editor as well. You can see women really starting to think about their place in society and question traditional gender roles. So it goes from everything from, you know, my husband doesn't help with the housework, that's not okay, is it? Through to things like, why aren't women being paid the same as men? So very kind of localized issues that might not be seen as feminism, but are certainly challenging gender dynamics, through to things of, you know, we need to have a more organized campaign to improve the position in society. So again, Betty Friedan used to talk about the readers of women's magazines being duped into, you know, idiocy, is the way she described it. But in fact, if you look at the letters pages, and the fact that the editors themselves are printing this content, it predisposes, you know, presuggests that women are intelligent readers who are capable of separating the aspirational from the real world, and also thinking about for themselves as well, you know, which seems like such an obvious thing, but you know, again, Friedan was so influential in the arguments she makes that kind of got forgotten for quite a while.
That's really marvelous. And if I may, actually, I want just to follow up with that, because this business, what you're doing of discovering some sort of radicalism in unsuspected places. And when we write about the history of women's movements in Ireland, we talk, of course, about those famous women who were out there protesting, whatever else. But I wonder about the roles of organizations like the ICA, the Irish Countrywomen's Association, or the Irish Housewives Association, whom I associate with a very different type of woman, the housewife, as she was known, the woman who perhaps read the woman's realm and the woman's way, and that. I wonder if there was something going on there too.
Yeah, absolutely there was. It's really interesting, kind of academics are pushing back against the labels of first and second wave feminism, because they create these artificial beginning and end points. And there has been a big move from people like Linda Connolly and Angela McRobbie and other scholars, Katrina Beaumont especially, to say, look, we need to look at this intermittent period between first and second wave feminism, when there are other things happening, that first and second wave are peak moments of activity, but there are these low levels in between. And in the Irish context, they point to the Irish Housewives Association and the Irish Countrywomen's Association. Now, the ICA is less political than the IHA is, but you know, if you look at what Hilda Tweedy is doing as the founder, one of the founders of the IHA, they are actively lobbying the government on the turnover tax, on inflation and so on. Their submission to the government on the eve of the budget in 1942, you know, becomes known as the Housewives budget. So yeah, they're not organized out on the street under banners saying equality for women, but they are, again, keeping women's issues on the agenda, and encouraging their members to think about their place in society. So, you know, again, it's a form of popular feminism where women think about maybe their own place as opposed to the bigger picture, but in doing that, it is keeping women's issues very much alive. And it also helps sustain, I think, the campaign between that peak moment of the suffragettes and then when it re-emerges in the late 60s, early 70s.
Thank you very much, yeah.
And I mean, building on that, obviously one of the other projects you've done is on electrification. Do you just want to explain what that was, and then I've got some questions on that.
Yeah, sure. So the electricity project came about because of a random conversation in what used to be my shared office at Hertfordshire, with Kerry Holbrook and Owen Davies, two of my colleagues who work mostly on folklore and faith and magic. And you would think, well, people working on folklore, faith and magic, what's that got to do with a Fine Gael historian, effectively? But, you know, you can find connections anywhere. So I had been working on the housewife and on the differences that piped water and electricity made to her day-to-day life, and how advertisements sold, you know, the all-electric house as the new modern way of living and so on. And Kerry and Owen had also been working on electricity, but had been looking at an earlier period when it first came into existence, and the fear that people had of electricity, that it could poison or it could cause lunacy, you know, to use the term at the time, and so on. And so we ended up getting together to create what we called the Electric Generations Project, and we're planning on hopefully turning this into a book as well, to chart what we saw as 3 stages in the reception of electricity in Ireland, starting off with the fear element of it, from things like electricity could cause a thatched roof in a house to go on fire, to people plugging the sockets in their home because they were afraid of electricity pouring out of it, to some of the more cynical concerns. And from the fear, we moved into the functionality element of it then, where the practical side of having an electric vacuum meant that you weren't, you know, sweeping the floor, or having an electric iron meant that you weren't going through the whole process of putting irons in the fire literally and then doing your ironing, through to the freedom side of it, where advertisers really bought into the idea of women as consumers and sold these products to them on the basis that they did the job quicker and faster, and as a result women would have all this wonderful leisure time, which of course is not the case at all. But it's just, again, from a women's history perspective, it's really interesting to look at the history of electricity through those 3 phases, because you can also see the transformation of women in society too, because I think electrification also plays a role in liberating women from the home and their opportunities to, for middle class women, that is, to shift into the workplace as well. You know, if you look at some of the advertisements for a fridge freezer, you know, they talk about doing all your cooking at the weekend and then freezing meals for the rest of the week, so that the wife can go out and actually have a job and come home in the evening and, you know, defrost whatever it was she made at the weekend, and therefore still fulfill all of the expectations of having been a good wife. And yes, we may roll eyes at that sort of thinking today, but it was part of this broader conversation about shifting women out of the home and, you know, into the wider world as well. So yeah, electricity, and as I say, 2 people working on folklore and someone working on Irish political history. It's amazing when you have these random conversations what comes out of them.
It's such a great topic, though. I mean, as you know, the ESV archives are kind of one of the great archives in Irish life that just haven't been plundered the way they should be.
Yeah.
And you do get those wonderful stories of fear of ladies kind of in rural areas turning on their light switch with a broomstick. Yes. Because they're fearful of actually touching it. But again, one thing I've always been fascinated by that, and I think what does it kind of somehow, in a bizarre way, tie some of your topics together, is when you look back at the ESV campaigns, which, I mean, were big. I mean, they really were, in terms of big scale, mega advertising campaigns that went across rural Ireland with the electric house and the demonstrations and everything they did. Clearly, one thing they did do was they modernised rural Ireland. Yeah. And you were right, you can roll your eyes and say, well, if you cook and freeze your meal, you can go out to work and in a way do more. But I think it then gets that other story that once people are working and they're getting on a bus in, you know, somewhere like Limerick to go out to a burgeoning industrial area like Shannon, and they're meeting ranges of different people, young people like themselves, that clearly that kind of electric moment is about rural Ireland kind of really coming alive. And going back to the political question, I'm always intrigued by kind of Fine Gael's relationship with the rural. That, you know, they do suffer that kind of Dublin 4 mentality that, you know, how do they break out into the rural areas? And in a way, how does that kind of arc of your work in a way with kind of issues around kind of women, feminism, gender, etc., gendered roles within the house, to domestic space, that once you let the domestic space loose, because you do reduce some of the labour, you'll certainly introduce more comfort, You introduced a world coming in by virtue of the radio and TV. How does that change of rural Ireland then speak to the kind of the political history of the state?
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Fine Gael, on one hand, have this reputation as being the party of farmers, and yet at the other hand, are seen as the D4 kind of elite set. And I suppose it speaks to the fact that Fine Gael has always been a coalition of interests, going back even to the Fine Gael era. But in terms of kind of the history of the state and how Fine Gael's relationship with it, it's interesting, I think, that they haven't perhaps made more of that element of modernisation, because, you know, obviously Patrick McGilligan is responsible for the Shannon scheme, or at least for initiating the conversations around it. But even James Dillon, when he's Minister for Agriculture, and I know, okay, at that stage he's not officially Fine Gael, but, you know, effectively he's seen in that context. He's alongside the ICA encouraging women to to look for piped water. He actually, alongside the ICA, sets this challenge to mothers to say to them, don't let your daughters marry unless they're going into a home that has piped water, you know, the equivalent today of make sure wherever you're going has broadband access. And so Fine Gael has actually been quite heavily involved in many of those key moments of modernisation in rural Ireland, but hasn't really engaged with that side of its history as much. I would say that speaks to a bigger issue in Fine Gael, which maybe again this is because of that long shadow that the blue shirts cast. Fine Gael hasn't been as willing, I think, overall, compared to perhaps Fianna Fáil, to talk about its history. And I know in recent years they've obviously made more of an effort to talk about 1948 and John A. Costello and so on, but it's not a party that has really embraced its history very often. You know, if you think about Fianna Fáil, they produced a book to mark, I think, its 75th anniversary, its 80th anniversary, perhaps. And those were projects that were initiated within the party itself. Fine Gael hasn't really done much of that. I mean, obviously, both of us spoke at an event out in the Green Isle Hotel in Dublin several years ago now at this stage, but that was one of the early, you know, the more recent examples of them doing that. You know, they're not as vocal about elements of their history, or indeed much of their history, as other political parties have been. And I do suspect that's because the minute they start talking about their history, the first thing to come up will of course be the blue shirts. Yeah.
But moving on, there's a question from Marjorie Howes, who says, it strikes me that one theme that has emerged in your discussion is an effort to reveal the fascinating and/or radical elements in the everyday/mainstream, rather than in the revolutionary or the transgressive. Would you like to say something about the challenges and payoffs of studying what we think of as the everyday as a historian?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I go back and forth, first of all, on the label "the ordinary woman," because it seems quite derogatory, or suggests that somehow that woman isn't important. But you know, historians are still trying to find a better label for it. But I found it really interesting to make that transition into the study of everyday life, because it's really helped me contextualize political decision making. When I wrote my book between this one and the Cosgrave one, which was about the Just Society, it was very much about, you know, policy making between the 60s and the 80s in terms of social justice. And that's when I got interested in everyday life, because I then started to think about, well, all of these policies are being conceived and debated for the betterment of society, but how are they actually received by the people for whom they're being created? And how do those people engage with it and negotiate this type of change as well? because, you know, change isn't always comfortable for people. And by studying the everyday life, I feel like I'm getting more of a kind of multi-layered understanding of political change in Ireland, not just from the perspective of, you know, the policymakers, but thinking about it through its different levels down to reception and integration as well. So I think the study of everyday life is actually really important in terms of helping us to understand how a state functions. It doesn't have to be Ireland, but how a state functions and how it deals with people within it, you know, both the everyday ordinary woman, but also then the transgressors and people on the margins as well. And it helps us understand actually how people end up out on the margins because of the way that they interpret the legislation themselves and the legislation interprets them, if that makes sense.
Joe, you had a question about sort of in a way that the everyday and where the church sat with it.
Well, yes, actually, and I'm talking about this thing that was the Irish housewife. And here's a few gross simplifications. I'm not a historian. It's sometimes said, you know, that the Irish male sought refuge in the protected space of the pub. Yeah, it's the space safe, that is, from womanhood, but also from priesthood, while his wife found refuge in the chapel or in the church. I wonder, have you any insights on the role of the clergy in the construction of that Irish woman, of that Irish housewife, of that idealized woman at the time?
Sorry, I'm not turning away from you. I'm just trying to find something that looks like another supplied prop, but genuinely this is a coincidence, right? It's just because I've been writing about women today. Right. So here we go. This is a marriage manual from the 1930s. It actually belonged to my grandmother. I found it in her papers. So, you know, here is my own everyday history intersecting with my own research. But these sorts of manuals, and this came from the Irish Messenger Office, these sorts of manuals, particularly in the first part of the 20th century, were quite common, either gifts to young wives when they were getting married, or they bought it themselves as a guide. And okay, what people did with them afterwards depended on the individual. But if you look through the content of it, it's got some really useful things like housekeeping and care and order in it. But actually, predominantly, it talks about God's will and cooperation and how to make sure religion is in the home. And it very much, in the Irish context at least, establishes the importance of Catholicism underpinning what it is to be a good wife and what, you know, a proper marriage should look like. And if you fast forward into the women's magazines, as much as they have these sort of radical elements to them, they also have the traditional. So Angela McNamara, who is the famed Agni aunt of the 1960s, who wrote for Woman's Way, when women wrote to her asking for advice about marital problems, she would typically refer them to their priest. Paul Ryan's work on her letters in the Sunday newspapers has found that of all the women who wrote to her who were experiencing domestic abuse, at no point did she ever encourage the woman to leave the home, but would rather suggest that the local priest be brought in to mediate. So it's really interesting, whether it's manuals like this or popular culture like the magazines, how much the church is a part of that narrative. But I would say there is a limitation to it, because when Woman's Way and its counterparts started to print things around sex education and dealing with the woman's body in general and around reproductive issues, there are a collection of letters in McQuaid's papers in the Dublin Diocesan Archive where some people are writing to him saying, you know, these magazines are wholly inappropriate and they need to be censored. And by the late 1960s, obviously McQuaid's influence is on the decline, and you can see that in these letters because he notes them but he doesn't act on them. And you can just think, you know, a decade earlier, Woman's Way would have been shut down so rapidly with the power that McQuaid had. So, you know, although the church obviously does play quite an influential role, at a certain point in the 20th century, you then start to see the drop off on that type of influence.
Marvelous. Thanks very much, Ciara. Yeah.
Brilliant, Ciara. We're all done.
Great, thank you.
It flew by. So stay there and wait a minute. Shall I talk about next week, Joe?
Yes, I'll just start off by saying actually that it's called next week's session, which is a particular one, is called Why All the Noise About Irish Studies, and it's picking up on that great time when Irish studies was sexy, maybe perhaps back in the 90s. You know, we had the Celtic Tiger and we had Troubles in the North and Good Friday Agreement, and then things went into a lull. But it seems like we've got some sort of a rise again in Irish studies, maybe throughout America, maybe throughout the world, certainly even at Boston College, actually. And we've got some really exciting speakers who Mike is going to tell you about next week, please.
So yeah, obviously this year, for all kinds of reasons which I think are real, there's been a whole group of publications in and around Irish studies. So we've got 4 people who have been involved in the editing collections. First of all, Renee Fox, who's from the University of California, Santa Cruz, who has edited the Routledge International Handbook of Irish Studies. Boston College's Marjorie Howes, who's produced not just 1, but 6 volumes of Irish literature in translation. Paige Reynolds from Holy Cross, who's produced an edited volume with Cambridge, The New Irish Studies. And then again, our own Jim Smith from BC, who's just produced a special issue of Air Island, a co-edited piece on transitional justice. So it's really bringing these 4 editors together to let them at it for an hour, to duke it out and actually try and understand, why is it suddenly in 2020 do we seem to be having a whole series of kind of quite, I think in retrospect, they will be seen as quite landmark publications where Irish studies is suddenly kind of having a beating heart again? Is that austerity, post-austerity? Is it the crash? You know, what brought us to this position where we've kind of stood back and looked at everything again? So that is 9:30 p.m. Irish time, 4:30 p.m. Boston time, next Friday. It's also our last one before Christmas. So if you want to turn up wearing a Christmas hat, Joe, please do.
I do want to say one more thing. Actually, I won't put on my Santa hat quite now. Next week I'll wear it, other things too. And to say that we're at the moment actually finalizing the details of the people who we're going to be bringing to you next semester, starting in January. And I really mean it's a really exciting collection of novelists, short story writers, historians of various sorts, of musicians, dancers, filmmakers. We're really trying to cover the entire gamut to the degree that we possibly can of Irish culture with some of the very, very top names. And we'll continue with this format, and I hope that you'll join us. We're looking forward to it hugely indeed. So there, thanks very much, Ciara. Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks very much, everybody else, for coming in. And one more thing, may I just also thank again, as I do, of course, not just Boston College and Boston College Ireland for working so hard at producing these things, but the Consul General in Boston, who of course sponsors us and is such a big part of actually bringing this to America, which is what we're trying to do. Thanks everybody very, very much.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks, Ciara.